Welcome to uh, video lecture number 2 on The Merchant of Venice, Act 1. We'll be taking a look at Scene 2 in this video. Where I want to start with this is a reminder about how the Elizabethan comedy, and certainly comedies in general, tend to work, whether you're talking about the ancient Greeks or whether you're talking about the modern sitcom. The general plot pattern that exists with the comedy is this. It begins with chaos. Generally in scene 1, chaos. Things are out of order as a comedy begins. So when we see this word chaos, we have to consider that things are out of order. And as the play progresses, it moves towards order as we get to the conclusion of the play, and order is restored by the end of the play. What happens between the beginning and the end of the play are all of the things that ultimately bring us to order. Now, there's an awful lot of disorder that will continue to ensue, and there's a lot that will happen to try to get us towards a point where everything is resolved. But as we take a look at Merchant of Venice, and we've seen Act 1, Scene 1 already, let's take a look at what potentially is the chaos that's ensuing at the beginning of the play. And remember, chaos doesn't necessarily have to mean all hell is breaking loose. Right? Chaos just means that something is out of order and needs resolution. Now, let's also keep in mind that the play is named The Merchant of Venice, and the Merchant of Venice is Antonio. He is the title character, so that's also something to keep in mind, right? He's an important character in the play, perhaps the most important character in the play. Heck, the play is named after him, named for him. So let's look at a couple of potential reasons. And as we learn right from the very get-go, right from the first lines of the play, Antonio tells us that he is sad. Well, certainly that's an out of order. Now, we don't know what Antonio's character is like prior to this. Maybe he's sad all the time. But based on the lines that he delivers, it seems that this perhaps is something that's new, something that may be growing, something that may be recent. And that in and of itself could denote chaos, right? Because again, it doesn't have to be earth shattering. So that's a potential thing, the chaos that begins. Another piece that could potentially be chaos, as we've learned in Act 1, Scene 1, is that Antonio has no cash right now. He's got no funds. And as it was suggested by his friends Solario and Solanio at the beginning of the play, perhaps you're concerned about your merchandise. Now, he does say, no, I am not. But he also could be lying to them. Perhaps he's too proud to let them know that, yes, in fact, I'm concerned about my merchandise. Maybe he's too high in stature to let anybody know that he might be concerned. So potentially, right? This could be the chaos that exists. He is the title character after all. He is the Merchant of Venice, and to lose his cash, to lose his standing, would have certainly a negative impact on him. And we also can't discount the possibility that, well, why can't it be both? It certainly could, right? Maybe there's a whole bunch of things going on in Antonio's life right now that have brought him to this place of melancholy that he perhaps hasn't figured out. A reminder about this, and this was in a previous video lecture, is when we take a look at the comedy, what we get is the chaos that we learn at the beginning of the play is generally considered the high plot line, and that's the line that will follow straight through the play. There'll be other plot lines that are generally going to happen in a comedy, but the main plot line, the high plot line, is the one that we remain most focused on. And the idea, of course, is that what we know, that what the audience recognizes pretty early in the play, is that there is a significant problem that the storyline is heading towards, or the supreme chaos. And the audience can see it coming. The audience knows. The characters probably don't, generally don't, but we see it, and it's represented there in that big X, right? And the plot line, the storyline heads towards this really big piece of chaos. But this is a comedy, and the general plot line of the comedy has the disaster ultimately being avoided, generally at the very last minute. Disaster is avoided, if you will, and then everyone comes out on the other side, generally speaking, okay. And that's usually something that, and certainly in the Shakespearean comedy, where all of that gets resolved, generally in Act 4, perhaps the beginning of Act 5, and then the remainder of the play ends up. We get to spend some time with our primary characters experiencing the joys of order, which in the Shakespearean play and many other dramas is demonstrated in a wedding or in multiple weddings, which is something that we tend to see. So that's as we begin the discussion on Act Two, Act One, Scene Two. So let's take a look at Scene Two, and another staple of the Shakespearean comedy, and that is this: that generally speaking, the Shakespearean comedy takes place in a duality of settings, generally two specific types of settings that in a previous video I referred to as the court and the forest. And the court represents the high society, right? The lifestyles of the rich and famous, the nobility, and it's generally pitted against the forest, and right, and that's the life, the world of those that are anything but the high and the mighty, generally the lowliest of characters. And what Shakespeare tends to do in his plays it's not that he pits them against each other. In some of the plays he does, but we see a comparison. We see the two different worlds, and we'll go back and forth from each scene from one world to the next. And ultimately, what happens is there becomes a fusion of the court and the forest, which is something that, of course, can't stay. Has to be resolved by the end as well. And so we move back and forth, and Scene Two in Merchant of Venice takes us over to the court. Right, Venice is the forest. Right, it's dirty, it's seedy, it's the underworld of the underbelly of the trading beast. Um, but Belmont is not that. Right, Belmont is the opposite of that. This here's an image of an estate, a 16th century, 15th century, 15th, 16th, 17th century estate called Penshurst estate. This was a famous estate back in the Renaissance time, but I thought it was a good image to use as we consider what Belmont really means in Merchant of Venice. It's not just the people who are living here are wealthy. They are beyond wealthy. Imagine whatever is the wealthiest thing you can think of, and then multiply that by 10, maybe 100, and that's what we're talking about over in Belmont. And this is where Portia lives, and she is the heiress to this estate. She is the only one who is heir to the estate. Her father, who had one child, and it was her, died, and she, without her being married, and this estate now falls in her hands. And as long as she remains unmarried, which in this world generally won't stay very long, right? Queen Elizabeth was unique in staying unmarried. In this day, you can be a social pariah if, in a lot of ways, if you don't do what's really required, and that is marry. So Scene Two takes us over to Belmont, where we meet Portia. And interestingly enough, as Scene Two begins, when we meet Portia, we learn that she has a similar affliction to Antonio. She too is sad. And her lines, as Act One, Scene Two begins, say this: "By my troth, Nerissa, my little body is aweary of this great world. By my truth," translate in truth, a phrase. And interesting, these are almost exactly the same words that Antonio begins with at the beginning of the play, right? "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad." His first lines. Act One, Scene Two, Portia. "By my troth, my little body's weary of this great world." Now, the interesting thing about the lines from both of these characters is this: Antonio is the merchant that all other merchants want to be. That's who he is. Portia is the rich heiress that everyone wishes they could be. And Antonio speaks his lines to two lesser merchants who kind of have to be like, really, this guy over here is sad, right? If we could have half of what he has, right, and he's sad. Well, Portia speaks these lines to her servant and friend Nerissa, who, of course, must look at her and think, "You've got all of this, and you're sad." And in fact, we Nerissa is uses some great language and kind of throws it right back into Portia. But think about this great balance that Shakespeare employs here, right? We've got two scenes at the beginning of this play that are essentially beginning the same way. One in the court. Well, Wes will start with the forest. One in the forest of Venice, and one here in the court in Belmont. There's this balance of these two worlds. Different characters, obviously, one male, one female, but you're still talking about the two people who are at the top of their games, right? The top of the world, the people that everyone else in the world would be envious of. And these people, something seems to be out of whack for them, right? The difference, of course, between the two as it begins is that we're left guessing what Antonio's sadness, weariness might be, but we learn about Portia's weariness and sadness, right? We hear it both from Portia and from Nerissa. Portia's lines that we hear at the beginning of Act One, Scene Two. She says this, and she's speaking to her friend Nerissa. She says, "But this reasoning is not in the fashion to choose me a husband. Oh, me, the word choose. I may neither choose whom I would, nor refuse whom I dislike. So is the will of a living daughter curbed by the will of a dead father. Is it not hard, Nerissa, that I cannot choose one, nor refuse none?" So what we learn here is that Portia is unable to choose a husband for herself still. Now, what we know, right, of course, in this day, consider Lord Capulet again from Romeo and Juliet, right? And this is not unusual with him, that it is the father who owns the daughter, and it is the father who determines who the daughter will marry, right? And a man of Lord Capulet's estate is going to make sure that his daughter marries somebody in an equal estate, or at least as close as he can get. Right. And you would presume that Portia's father would have done the same thing. The thing is that Portia's father dies before he gets the opportunity. Or did he just simply never take the opportunity? One of the things we'll learn about Portia is that she probably should have been married off some time ago. And for some reason, it seems that the father never did that. Interesting thing to consider why that may happen. And we'll see, like we talked about balance here, we'll see a similar balance with Shylock and his daughter. Like the father who should have married off the daughter but hasn't done it yet. Why? Well, we'll never know in this play because the father's dead and the only one who's left is Portia. But we do know what he did do was he left instructions in his will on whom Portia should marry. Now, would Portia be obligated legally to respond to the will? No. And in fact, she could have made sure that nobody saw the will. Technically, with the death of the father, she is free to choose whom she will. And yet, Portia feels still confined by the will that the father has. And we'll find out more specifics about what he has to say. But it says something about the character of Portia, that even in death, she is going to obey the father. Contrast that with Juliet, if you will, right? How does Juliet respond with her father's will? Juliet, of course, responds by refusing to accept the father's will and escapes and marries Romeo. Now, Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. And of course, in Shakespeare's tragedies, there has to be moral retribution, right? Any sin that occurs in a Shakespearean tragedy must be met with some sort of moral retribution. You have to pay back for your sins. And unfortunately, is the case of the Shakespearean tragedy, generally the penalty that is paid is death. And we can argue that that's probably harsh, and in some cases it is. But that ends up being the fate of the characters who violate the moral code. But in this particular case, it doesn't have to be upheld because the father's dead and it is her choice. And yet, Portia is going to stick by this. Says something about her. She will be compared to Portia, who is also, she's got the same name as Brutus's wife. And let's consider Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, and there's no question that there are references here to that from that play, and I think Shakespeare is doing this knowingly. But Portia, of course, Brutus's wife, as we learn in Julius Caesar, and historically as well, right, is the daughter of a great Roman herself, and she is true to Rome and to Brutus. She remains true to the very end, and perhaps there's she is aptly named Portia. Because this Portia in Merchant of Venice seems to be dutifully bound to the father and the fatherland, if you will, Belmont, in the same way that Portia from Julius Caesar is dutifully bound to her fatherland and her father and her husband. So this is Portia's lines, right? And so again, in the beginning, we have this scene with these two friends, and they are here in Belmont, and what we learn is that again, suitors from across the planet are arriving at Belmont to woo the rich heiress Portia. There are people in the house in Belmont who are there specifically to offer to try to gain Portia's hand in marriage. An interesting similarity here between Portia and the suitors that were, if you recall, in the Odyssey, right? Strangely similar to Penelope's suitors who have gathered at the house and they're waiting to win the hand of Penelope, right? Because to win the hand of Penelope in the Odyssey will give whoever marries her essentially the kingdom of Ithaca, right? So more similarities to other texts that we've probably seen. As this scene continues in lines 31 to 85, what we get is that it's a somewhat comical scene because what you have is you have Nerissa and Portia who are seem to be overpeering, to be looking at the group of the suitors who have arrived. And what's going to happen is Nerissa is going to name them off one at a time, and Portia is going to describe them for her. And this description of these men is not flattering. In fact, it's quite abusive. If these men were to have heard what Portia is saying about them, they might not appreciate it. But there's great comedy that ensues in it. I won't go through it. I encourage you to read through the text and see what she has to say about all these men. But she essentially eviscerates them verbally outside of their ear. In other words, none of them are suitable suitors as far as she's concerned, right? There are people dressed like clowns. There are people who can't speak their own language or any other language. There are people there that are in debt. There are people there that are drunks, and she just doesn't like any of them. And she, and this scene, she just destroys these guys. She hates all of them. As we get through the scene, and the two young ladies are enjoying a laugh over this, right? As they make fun of the men who have gathered to marry her, and so we continue on. Lines 86 through 99, we learn that each of these men who has gathered actually has decided to leave. They because we hear for the first time some rules that apply to marrying Portia, that these rules that are contained in the father's will, and none of the men that are there seem to want to abide by the rules. And so instead of sticking around to try to win Portia's hand, all of these men have decided to leave. And Nerissa is the one who tells Portia this good news, my dear Portia, they're all leaving. In line 100, we learn, right, as the two young ladies talk about, well, who would be the perfect man to marry? And the name that pops up, of course, is Bassanio. And we learn that Portia has met, and Nerissa has met. They have met Bassanio before. He had presented himself as a nobleman once before, and they believed that he was, and they thought he was quite a catch. And of course, we know that he's not. He's a fraud. But they had seen him before, and they say, "Oh, if only, remember that Bassanio guy? If only he would show up at your front door." At the very end of scene 2, and what I think for the late 20th century, 21st century readers, watchers of the play, minds even. There's a very challenging end to Act One, Scene Two, for us, but not necessarily so for folks of the Renaissance, because what we learn at the end of the scene is that a prince from Morocco is on his way to Belmont. An advance scout has come and let folks know that the prince is on his way to try to woo Portia to win her hand in marriage. And the lines that I'm specifically referring to, lines 110 to 115, are very racially charged. They're challenging lines, right? Because Morocco is, of course, a black man. And what we learn is that Portia, in no manner, shape, or form, has interest in a man who has the complexion of a devil, as she says, even if he had the condition of a saint, even if he was the best man on the planet, but had the color skin that he has, she would not accept him. Again, tremendously racially charged, and certainly poses significant challenges, I think, for us in the 21st century. However, in the Renaissance, that's not the case, right? We have all types of racial and ethnical intolerance of the day. And certainly the audience that would be watching this play in 1597 would feel very similarly, I think, to Portia. And there may even be an audible gasp when they learn that the Prince of Morocco is coming to try to win her hand, because this can't possibly be right. It's not. It wouldn't be right for a man with black skin to be able to marry the very white, rich heiress Portia. And so, right there, this, the audience is probably a little on the edge. Ooh, that can't be a thing, right? This is the late 1590s. And so I think the audience response to this particular, these particular lines, 110 to 115, the audience might be nodding along with Portia's lines. But I think today we look at those lines and we might be taken aback by them, because it's a different time, right? We have a different set of values today. So keep that in mind as you read through, certainly any of the Shakespeare texts, that the value set's a little bit different. I think one of the things that Shakespeare's doing here, though, and I think it's often interesting to try to wrangle with the question, what was Shakespeare's intent, and while it might seem here that Shakespeare is towing the racial line as everybody else, it's also quite possible that Shakespeare knows what he's doing and might very well be exposing the audience for the people that they really are. So there are some folks who suggest that no, actually Shakespeare wasn't intolerant and was kind of in a very careful, quiet way, throwing some shade at the way people behave. This is the end of scene 2, and I just want to mention that it's similar to the consider this at the end of Act 1, Scene 1. All of the lines in Act 1, Scene 2 are spoken in prose. Now, all of the lines in Act 1, Scene 1 are spoken in verse. And consider the why. And if we think about the way that Shakespeare frequently utilizes blank verse over prose in a play, has to do with character stations in life. And while Portia certainly is the wealthiest person that we will meet in almost any Shakespeare play, right? The wealthiest person we'll meet. So financially stands head and shoulders above anybody else. That alone is not enough to change the fact that she's a woman. And because of that, likely she is afforded only speaking in prose. Now, I know Juliet speaks in blank verse. A couple of things. One, it's a different time when Shakespeare's writing, and he uses prose and poetry a little bit differently in his plays in his earlier plays. But Juliet is an heiress to a kingdom, a real kingdom, a kingdom, Capulet's kingdom that has a very, very powerful political place in Verona, and we don't see this in Belmont. It doesn't seem as though Portia has any political capital whatsoever. And so she's really socially nothing. And perhaps this is why the entirety of this scene is spoken in prose. Whereas in the first scene, what you have is you have Antonio throughout the entire scene. And because he's there and he's who he is, all the language is in blank verse. And so that brings an end to our video lecture discussion on The Merchant of Venice, Act 1, Scene 2. We'll see you at the next one.